This episode contains overtly graphic content that may be found disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 10, Jager. As the evening grew darker, the skies above held a mild glow from the city streets below, assisted by the moon glimmering overhead. As nearby traffic offered its bustling ambience, it darted this way and that, casting its reflections upon the glass windows of an upscale and familiar diner. Lenkov sat in his limousine just outside, now parked across the street. He watched the restaurant through his window as the partition to the driver remained down. The well-dressed man behind the wheel occasionally looked in his mirror for his boss to signal a departure. But instead, the oligarch remained focused on the restaurant, watching for someone of interest. Eventually, he saw Agent Shields depart from the same doors that he had just left through himself, not moments ago. He watched the young agent and studied him, trying to read his body language as Thomas let the doors close behind him. Suddenly, Lenkov received a phone call as he reached down between the seats and pressed a button. Feedback came over the vehicle's speakers as the phone call was now active. "Da," Lenkov answered, while studying his American counterpart across the road. A voice came from over the speaker. "Everything is in order," the voice stated. Lenkov sat for a moment in silence as he watched Thomas peer over at the limo and then look away as he proceeded to walk to his car. Having seen that Thomas did not confront him, cueing the agent's reluctant but valuable cooperation, Lenkov now seemed satisfied as he returned to the business at hand. He then nodded his head at his driver as the partition between them went up and the limousine slowly departed from the restaurant. Lenkov, still on the phone, answered the man on the other end. "And the construction is nearly completed, yes?" And as one joins the caller on the other end, a construction site within a large hangar begins to unfold. And this hangar could only be found within a top-secret military base in a remote American desert. Arlo Brooks, the voice from the other side of Lenkov's phone conversation, dutifully surveyed the construction site, walking on the scaffolding high above a massive vessel still being built. Arlo continued his phone call as he stopped to look down at the craft in question, an entourage of security personnel at his side. As he took in the site, humans and several dark-scope construction robots busily worked together, depicting a project on par only with what many would deem simply science fiction. They were building something massive, something mankind has never known to be possible. And this vessel, this large aerial craft being built, was none other than the ship that would eventually capture and transport millions of human cattle. A ship called Sanctuary. Arlo looked down and answered Lenkov before ending his phone call. "Yes, it is nearly completed. We will begin to expand exporting within the next few months. This vessel is sure to speed up the shipping progress. And once we back the Pentagon into making their move, she will be the perfect vessel to gather the remaining goods left behind." Nearly back in present day, we come to a familiar place and a not-so-distant event. It was the Beltron Leva stronghold, the Chancellor's home of operations. This night was special, however, as this was the night that laid in the aftermath of the last state's raid upon the cartel's fortress. The Ecuadorian beaches boasted of a blissful calm, as the darkest of nights provided a blank canvas along its glassy ocean's surface, allowing the moon's reflection to sparkle from within. As the waves crashed along the shores, they sounded off with their expertise as they found themselves within a typical pattern, and the jungles off in the distance only framed the scene with that much more elegance, as the moon behind its cloudy home caused the distant leafy tapestry to slightly shimmer. There, amongst the cusp where sand meets water, a small black helicopter sat quietly waiting, its windows darkened. The aerial vehicle seemed to be small, yet very well armed, remaining motionless, appearing to be waiting patiently, watching the jungles that sat in the distance. It was there by itself, as one female stood in front of it, carefully watching her surroundings. She patiently watched as her men all remained in the helicopter just behind her. She was about 6 feet in height and wore straight black hair while wearing a long trench coat. Seeming to be in her early to mid-20s, she held a darker tone of skin, proudly representing her Asian heritage. She stood completely still as she held a serious expression, focusing on the forests before her. Then suddenly, she lifted her arm and yelled one word as she noted a disturbance from the vast coastal woodlands around. "There!" she exclaimed as a door to the helicopter behind her quickly opened, a thin, tall gentleman soon joining her on the sand. And there, as they watched, a disturbance within the trees quickly began to take place. Now hurtling towards them, several military vehicles raced across the sandy terrain. Eventually, the small convoy, about 9 vehicles in all, made their final approach. While the two stood there, blocking the headlights from their eyes with their hands, they soon became surrounded as one vehicle parked closer to them than the rest. Now, with all the vehicles having come to their stops, they stood there, awaiting to be addressed, while the closest rig's back door soon began to open. And from this door, another female, this one dressed in military fatigues, stepped out and away from her seat as she touched the sandy floors below. She then quickly walked up to the pair in front of the helicopter and saluted them, awaiting her permission to speak. Then, while looking at her, the Asian woman addressed the soldier, opening a dialogue between the three. "At ease, Sergeant. I assume the targets have been taken care of," she said, looking to her soldier with a sense of high expectation in her eyes. As she did this, a familiar face removed her hand from its salute, placing it back by her side as she proceeded to be debriefed. "The town of Vuelta Larga has been cleaned. Esmeralda is way too fortified and will be much more difficult, so it'll be handled at 0900 when decontamination begins," she said, cuing her superior to pose another question. "And Lazar?" she asked, gaining a somewhat prepared response from her high-ranking soldier. "Not yet, but we're closing in on him. I identified one of the remains in Vuelta Larga to be that of his brother, Santiago. Lazar is bound to be nearby. Now goes by the Chancellor, however. And the perimeter? We don't want anyone slipping through our fingers." The officer then answered as quickly as she had before, as she pulled a radio from her side. "One of my officers is securing it now. It's the first of many runs we'll be making throughout the night." Her superior replied, cueing that their conversation was winding down as she began to head back to her helicopter. "Perfect. Keep up the good work. And be careful. Our intelligence has picked up movement somewhere in your area. We believe it's the so-called New America. Remember, I want to be informed on their status as well. I am not happy with them operating at such a level of independence. They are still our military. Either they stand by the last state, or they are targeted like the rest of these cartel factions. We need to sever their ties with the Russians and end this separation between our forces, once and for all. Rein them in, Sergeant. And with that, before her two superiors boarded their vehicle, the soldiers saluted them one last time. Yes, ma'am, you can count on my team. And with that, the soldier was left alone on the sand as she watched the helicopter ascend into the darkened night sky. As she stood there, she watched it slowly disappear, soon joined by one of her men. We should get moving, Sergeant. We don't have a good enough perimeter set up yet. And knowing that her senior lieutenant was right and still holding the radio in her hands, did not look at the soldier who'd had addressed her, raising the device to her lips. Andrews, perimeter status, over. Present day, somewhere in the Philippines. Alina grew up in this world. She didn't have any memories of what things were like before the earth went dark, because when it did, she was just the tender age of 4. Having been deprived of any semblance of an easy life, the violent world she lived in served as her normal. Constantly moving from place to place, looking for food and shelter with her father and her younger brother. Where she called home, now a far cry from what it once was, the Chinese had stepped in and had taken control. Word was, the Chinese government was working hand in hand with the Russians, the Chinese, now having jurisdiction over a vast region of the globe, including Europe, where she and her family had once lived. Unfortunately, normality was about to be replaced with even more chaos, as Alina found herself in a series of events that led her and her family down a dark path. Having been separated from her father and brother, when the three were searching for supplies, Alina knew that she was in dire straits as she had been taken from her home in Ukraine and was then transported for several days across land and sea. It all began when her family was detained by a Chinese military faction, this foreign government now having the upper hand in local law and order. At first, they were simply held along with many others, thousands of people just like them, only seeking hope and refuge. But then, they found themselves being processed for rehoming. As they all knew that this was not a good direction they were being forced into, it was the least of Alina's worries, as she was identified by the military as a person of interest. She was to be sent to the Philippines to be evaluated, being separated from her father and brother, who found themselves helpless while being drugged from their sight. She had no idea why she had been singled out, and not understanding the language of this foreign military, she had no idea what was to become of her. All she knew was that they saw her as important, and from what little she could understand, the best she could make out was that she was to be brought to someone who was called the Jager. After several days of being transported by soldiers not willing to speak with her, giving her nothing but sips of water from time to time, she finally found herself within the Philippines. As panic remained at the forefront within her mind, she looked around while traveling the bumpy roads, viewing its vast skeletal remains. A war-torn network of infrastructure and a dilapidated shadow of what it used to represent now surrounded them. Eventually, as the vehicle slowed, she looked ahead to see an old building resembling what may have been a factory once upon a time. And once slowing to a complete stop, signaling this eerie environment as her destination, she found herself being dragged from her seat, noting the grim sight in front of her, unaware of what horrors awaited her inside. Not willing to go down without a fight, Alina immediately objected and attempted to run. But this attempt to free herself only took her so far, as she was soon met with the butt of a rifle to her face. And as she fell back to the ground, she could taste her own blood pooling up between her lips, the world around her slowly fading away. After several hours, she slowly came to, lying on the floor of a dirty cell somewhere within the drafty structure. And as she looked around, seeing nothing but dirt floors and 4 metal walls, her anxiety only grew. What could they possibly be after? What could they possibly want from her? But that was when she heard the only door to the room begin to open. And as she got to her knees, she wiped the blood from her lips as she saw a man begin to enter her cell. She then nervously watched him as he came to the middle of the room and began to speak. "I am told you are one of those that can see," he said, gaining a small look of confusion from his hostage's face. "You see these dark figures, do you not?" And then, hearing these words come from the stranger's mouth, Alina remembered her bizarre encounters with the shadowy figures as she grew up. Her father and brother would always believe her. They would always look to see if what she was seeing was really there. But after so many times of this happening, she began to feel as if she were going mad, trying to ignore the sightings altogether, pointing them out over the years. Less and less. That was when the mysterious stranger in front of her began speaking once more. "Ah, you remember now. You've tried so hard to keep it a secret, haven't you? You've tried to put it aside, attempting to forget all about it, writing each sighting off as simply a fluke. You want to feel normal. You just want to be like the rest, like your brother and your father. You just want to fit in." The man continued speaking as Alina's mind raced. She hadn't given these encounters much consideration until now, after all, only trying to survive and not wanting to be looked at as some kind of liability. Nevertheless, the strange man before her continued. "If only it could be that simple, trying to hide what we really are. But we know that's not possible. Eventually, we are all discovered and used for our various potentials." He then took a small breath as he let out a sigh as he pressed on. "But for someone like you, someone with such a gift, if discovered by our enemies, it could be used against us. And that is something we simply cannot risk." The man then paused, turned and walked toward the open door. He then whispered something into the ears of a few Chinese soldiers just outside, as they quickly saluted him and shut the door. This, making Alina's heart skip a beat, echoed a haunting whisper of dark curiosities, her mind beginning to imagine every macabre scenario it could possibly muster. And as the man approached once more, he began to formally introduce himself, his eyes seeming to penetrate the poor girl's soul. "They call me the Jager. I provide services to very powerful people. You see, this gift you have has caused my clients many problems, and it is my objective to neutralize this issue." He then fell silent for a moment more as he looked up as if in deep thought. "Of course, I cannot simply eliminate you. What good would you be to me then? I would still have the same problem. The sevens would remain. No, this would be no good. I must take advantage of having such a specimen within my possession." He then looked back down at his hostage as he continued, now speaking softly, yet with a more menacing tone, words of terror for the unfortunate girl slipping effortlessly from his tongue. "I must study it. I must observe it." And as he leaned in closer, he said his next words slowly. "I must dissect it." And after allowing Alina's horror flush icy waves of fear through her veins, the man then posed a question, causing her to slightly tremble, hair beginning to stand on end upon the back of her neck. "I wonder, little girl, can you not detect these entities? If you no longer had the ability to see?" And as silence fell between the two, Alina's heart began to pound as the man before her slowly smiled, answering his own question he had posed for her. "I guess we will just have to find out." With that, The door behind him swung open as several men in what appeared to be medical gowns and face masks began to approach. Alina, now frozen in place, felt her slight tremble take hold of her entire body as a single tear fell from her face. And as the next few hours of this poor girl's life began to align with her darkest nightmares, sheer pain and agonizing procedures began taking place. And once she was left alone and all was said and done, Alina's world darkened one last and final time. Meanwhile, upon this same abandoned landscape, several miles away, a familiar car traverses the tattered roads. Here can be found two people of interest as they make their way through unfamiliar terrain, seeking their contact, Logan. They had not been driving for very long as Trevor sat quietly, trying to articulate his questions that seemed to ricochet across his mind. He looked at Kit, wondering if she were okay. She seemed bothered by her abilities, and for some reason or another, didn't like speaking about them either. Trevor, knowing that this was no time for self-preservation, no matter who may be hiding what, pressed the matter nonetheless. "So, you gonna fill me in about your little thing back there at the landing strip?" Kit sighed and looked over at Trevor. She wanted to be honest with him, but she knew he still was in the dark on so much. She also couldn't help a strange feeling she had for him, as he gave her a sense of home when she was around him. She looked at Trevor, and unlike her typical spunky self, she flashed him a lackluster smile and reluctantly answered her teammate. "I wish they never discovered it," she said, causing Trevor to look at her slightly confused. She noted his state of confusion, spelled clearly across his naive face as she continued. "DX gas. I hate it. It comes in many forms. They found it on Darius a long time ago. Since then, they have crushed it into countless types of compounds, one of them being this gel substance. The green cube you've seen. The first few times, it was fine. I always made sure I had the right reasons for using it, reserving it as a last line of defense. Still, it doesn't matter. Over time, it takes its hold." Trevor remembered her words from days ago. She had warned him not to have the element inside him for too long. She said he wouldn't want to let it take its full effects. As he pondered this, he grew worried for his friend and posed his next question. "So, what's it like?" Kit looked over at him and held back a small laugh. She then looked forward as she continued driving while she responded to him. "Wonderful, amazing, blissful, yet terrifying, lonely, and hopeless." He noticed the contrast of her words and caught onto her pattern of emotions she spelled out for him, feeling somewhat responsible as she used it twice already to save his life. Trevor could not help but to feel bad for her while she continued speaking. "Once it takes its hold, you are more powerful than ever. Placing second to immortality, it can increase your lifespan by hundreds of years. Your faculties multiply as your DNA molecules undergo massive renovations." Trevor looked at her, not understanding her complaints. As it sounded to him, this was the perfect way to fight against the threat from above. She had expected this reaction as she did not even look at him while she continued to explain. "And once it takes its full effects, you are bereft of all emotion, unable to feel happy, or sad, afraid, or angry. And it's just as bad with your other senses as well. You can't feel your own skin, taste your own food, or even smell your own aroma." Increasingly troubled by all this, Trevor's worry for Kit only grew as he commented on her words. "Do you ever feel those things?" he asked as he looked over at her, afraid of her answer. He would hate to believe that she was slowly being hollowed out as he had grown to enjoy her authentic persona. She just shrugged her shoulders, seemingly deep in thought as she formed her words rather softly. "The bad things? I suppose, from time to time, I know what it's slowly doing to me, and I also know what it can do if I am not careful," she said while glancing over at him. "But I won't let that happen. All the wonderful feelings, though, they've been getting more regular. It takes longer and longer for it to wear off the more I use them." She continued to speak as Trevor listened. "The thing I did back there, I can't just do that anytime I want. At least, not yet. Well, hopefully never. I'm only able to conjure up such a task when I am backed against a corner or when my life is threatened. Even then, it's not sure to work." Trevor just sat there in silence. He knew there was nothing he could do to calm her worries, as he was very uneducated about the foreign element. A sense of calm washed over the interior of their vehicle as it made its way through the vacant town. As they drove, Kit broke the awkward silence as she figured a change of subject would be good for their morale. "Okay, so like I said before, this guy is a ghost. We gotta talk to the right people in order to find him. We cannot talk to the wrong people. Talking to the wrong people anywhere in the Philippines will not be good for us." As she finished her words of caution, Trevor wished to clarify a certain matter. "And what happens if you talk to the wrong people?" Kit looked at him, grimaced. "They walk around just like any other transient, searching for food, water, or shelter. But if you happen to run across them, and if you fit the profile of a perfect target, then you're in for one shit show. Look, the Philippines is just like any other place. They have their open pastures, their feedlots, and they have their abattoirs as well. But the difference here is the rest of the region is under the control of one man. And this man is searching for something. What? We don't know. But from our intelligence, we've gathered that he is in charge of some kind of research. Whatever this research is, the reports we've received, it's through live specimen experiments. Human specimen, to be more specific. This man is looking for something." She then looked over at Trevor once more as she went on. "Or looking for someone." Trevor found her words rather sobering as she then proceeded to give him some advice. "Just don't make eye contact with anyone if you see something or someone. Say something. We need to do our best to avoid being found by this man or his cronies. They are not easy to spot, but they are noticeably different than everyone else." Trevor thought to himself as he pressed her to continue. Different? How? Everyone else is scavenging for supplies. These people, however, scavenge for human targets, specimens for their cause. "They watch people from a distance," she said while looking out the window at the abandoned buildings they carefully traversed through. This caused Trevor to do the same as his paranoia grew, while Kit continued. "They study them, looking for the perfect specimen. They are everywhere. And if you don't keep your eyes open, you won't see them until you're in their possession, somewhere in one of their labs, waiting to be their next experiment. He runs this entire area. There are no cattle operations here. The Chinese have given him reign over this portion of the Philippines to further his research." She then let out a frustrating sigh. God only knows why Logan chooses to operate here. Lucas wanted him to vacate once reports began pouring in of this research operation, but Logan ignored the request. And to our surprise, Logan and his operations seemed to be doing just fine. Trevor looked at the empty streets around him. He could not believe that such an empty place like this could hold such a dynamic community. While rounding the corner, he noticed a rundown building right outside his window as his eyes shifted over its two large wooden doors. And as their car slowly disappeared out of sight, it soon became clear what Trevor had seen, as red graffiti, almost appearing blood-like in color, spelled out a familiar name. high up on the structure's exterior wall.